The two figures have stood together for more than a century. One appears to lean into the other, their bodies locked together as the world collapsed around them. Visitors have called them sisters. Others believe they were a mother and daughter, refusing to let go until the very end. Their story has been told in museums, documentaries, and history books across the world. Then scientists looked inside, not at the plaster that millions of people have seen, but at the skeletons hidden beneath it. Using CT scanners and fragments of ancient DNA, they discovered something almost no one expected. The pair were not close relatives at all. One was biologically male. The identities that had survived for generations were built not on evidence, but on assumptions. If one of Pompeii's most famous stories was wrong, an unsettling question follows. How many more were never true? That question reaches back nearly 2,000 years to the morning when life in Pompeii still appeared ordinary. Merchants opened their shops, bakers prepared bread, children played in the streets. Mount Vesuvius towered above the city, familiar enough that few residents imagined it as a threat. Then the mountain exploded. Columns of ash climbed into the sky before collapsing into waves of superheated gas and volcanic debris racing toward the city. Roofs failed beneath the weight of falling pumice. Darkness replaced daylight. Those who remained searched desperately for shelter or escape, but the eruption unfolded far faster than most people could outrun. When the ash finally settled, Pompeii disappeared. Not for years, for centuries. Its streets, houses, temples, workshops, and thousands of lives remained sealed beneath volcanic deposits, untouched by weather, rebuilding, and later occupation. It became one of history's greatest archaeological time capsules. Yet even after the city was rediscovered, one mystery proved impossible to solve. Where had the victims gone? Excavators eventually noticed strange hollow spaces inside the hardened ash. They were shaped like human bodies, but completely empty. The explanation was astonishing. The ash had buried people so quickly that it hardened around them. Over time, their soft tissues decayed, leaving cavities that perfectly preserved the final outlines of their bodies. In 1863, Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli decided to fill those voids with liquid plaster. When the surrounding ash was carefully removed, the victims appeared once again. The results were unlike anything archaeology had seen before. Faces twisted in pain, hands covered mouths, bodies curled into defensive positions. These were not statues carved by artists. They were the final moments of real people preserved by catastrophe itself, or so it seemed. The casts were extraordinary, but they also encouraged something archaeology constantly struggles against: storytelling without enough evidence. A smaller figure beside an adult became a child. Jewelry suggested a woman. Two bodies lying together became family members. Every pose invited a narrative, and because those narratives felt emotionally convincing, few people questioned them. After all, what else could they be? For more than 150 years, almost no one had a way to find out. Then medicine entered the investigation. Researchers began bringing hospital-grade CT scanners to Pompeii. Instead of examining the plaster itself, they peered through it. Layer by layer, the machines reconstructed the bones sealed inside. Suddenly, the casts stopped being sculptures and became forensic evidence. The scans exposed skulls, vertebrae, ribs, and pelvises that had remained hidden since the 19th century. Some skeletons looked different than expected. Pelvic structure contradicted earlier assumptions. Skull morphology raised new questions. Age estimates no longer matched traditional interpretations. The investigation was beginning to challenge stories that had once seemed beyond dispute. But anatomy could only take researchers so far. To answer the biggest questions, they needed evidence written inside the victims themselves: DNA. Recovering ancient DNA from Pompeii is extraordinarily difficult. Heat damages genetic material. Moisture destroys it. Contamination threatens every sample. Researchers carefully selected protected areas of bone, extracting only tiny fragments in the hope that some ancient molecules had survived nearly 2 millennia. Many had not, but several had. Those few genomes became some of the most important pieces of evidence ever recovered from Pompeii. One famous cast showed an adult apparently shielding a child. For generations, visitors saw a mother's final act of protection. The DNA revealed something entirely different. The adult was biologically male. Even more surprising, the child shared no close biological relationship with him. The image had never changed. Only the evidence had. Immediately, another mystery emerged. If they were not father and child, or mother and child, why had they died together? Had they simply fled into the same room? Were they neighbors, household servants, friends? Complete strangers caught in the same desperate attempt to survive? DNA could reveal biological relationships. It could not explain human courage. Researchers turned to another iconic pair, famous for their embrace. Again, the emotional interpretation seemed obvious. Again, the evidence refused to cooperate. The individuals were not close relatives. Genetic analysis indicated different biological sexes, despite decades of assumptions that they were sisters or a mother and daughter. The embrace remained heartbreakingly real, but its meaning became far more complex. Perhaps catastrophe creates families of circumstance. In moments of terror, strangers may comfort strangers. That possibility had rarely entered earlier interpretations. Then, investigators examined another group discovered together on a staircase. They had long been presented as an entire family trying to escape the eruption together. Once again, DNA dismantled the story. No close biological relationships connected the group. For over a century, archaeologists and the public had unconsciously linked proximity with kinship. But disasters do not organize themselves around family trees. Hundreds of frightened people move through the same streets, crowd into the same buildings, and reach for the same exits. Shared fate does not necessarily mean shared ancestry. By now, the investigation had overturned one assumption after another. Yet the biggest revelation was still waiting. DNA can reveal more than family relationships. It can preserve echoes of ancestry stretching back thousands of years. When researchers compared the recovered genomes with ancient and modern populations across the Mediterranean, another pattern began to emerge. Some individuals carried ancestry consistent with connections extending beyond the Italian peninsula, including regions associated with Greece, the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. The finding did not stand alone. Archaeology had been pointing in the same direction for decades. Imported glass arrived from distant workshops. Amphorae carried wine and olive oil across the sea. Coins circulated from every corner of the empire. Ships entered nearby ports carrying merchants, sailors, freed slaves, soldiers, craftsmen, and travelers whose lives crossed continents with remarkable frequency. Pompeii was not an isolated Roman town. It was one stop in a civilization connected by thousands of kilometers of roads and shipping lanes. Suddenly, the DNA findings looked less like a surprise and more like another piece of a much larger puzzle. The Roman Empire was far more mobile than many people imagine. People moved because of trade, because of opportunity, because of military service, because of slavery, because entire lives unfolded across a Mediterranean that functioned less as a barrier than as a highway. The victims preserved beneath Vesuvius may represent only a small sample, but their genomes support the archaeological picture of Pompeii as a city shaped by movement, exchange, and diversity rather than isolation. And that realization transforms the eruption itself. Vesuvius did not simply preserve one Italian town, it preserved a crossroads of an empire. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery, however, has nothing to do with ancestry. It is the realization that the plaster casts never lied. We did. The poses were always real. The bones were always there. The evidence had remained unchanged since AD 79. What changed was the story we placed upon it. Humans are remarkably good at recognizing patterns, even when the evidence is incomplete. We see jewelry and assume gender. We see two bodies touching and assume family. We see a child beside an adult and instinctively create a relationship. Science asks a more difficult question. How do we know? That simple question is quietly transforming Pompeii. Every new CT scan, every isotope study, every microscopic analysis, and every fragment of ancient DNA shifts archaeology away from compelling narratives and toward testable evidence. Some beloved stories survive that process. Others dissolve as completely as the victims themselves once did beneath the volcanic ash. The investigation ends where it began, with two figures locked together in their final moments. For generations, they represented a story people wanted to believe. Today, they represent something even more valuable, a reminder that history is not frozen in stone, plaster, or ash. It changes every time we learn to see evidence that was hidden all along. The scientists were not simply correcting the identities of a few victims. They were exposing a far larger truth. The greatest danger in archaeology is not that the past disappears, it is that certainty arrives before the evidence does. And beneath the streets of Pompeii, science is still teaching us the difference.